We're continuing the tour of Tate Britain with the 1840 room. And in that room, there's a number of works which, as you probably know, are hung floor to ceiling. And what I'm going to do is to spend 2 weeks in that room, as there's so many works. And the first week, this week, is going to be about the Pre-Raphaelites with some other works. And then next week is the aesthetic movement, where I go around the same room, picking out some different pictures. But before I get started on the Pre-Raphaelites, I've got some introductory slides to give you some background on the Pre-Raphaelites and also the social situation at the time, because they were founded in 1848. And that's a significant year across Europe, because there were a lot of revolutions of different types going on across Europe. And in the UK, the Chartist movement, which was founded about 10 years previously, about 1838, organized a large petition, 6 million signatures, although the number of signatures varies, accounts vary as to how many, was going to be, this petition was going to be handed in at Downing Street, and Chartists came from all over the country to meet at Kennington Common prior to taking the petition to Downing Street. And you can see this is one of the few photographs. It's actually from a pub on the, what would be the west side of Kennington Common. Kennington Common is well known to me because you see these buildings at the back here. They were pulled down later, and a road called DeLawn Street was built there, which is where my mother grew up. So it's familiar to me. It's very different today, because in those days, there was no restriction on where factories could be built. And you can see here is a sulfuric acid factory. There's a tannery, which must have smelt terribly. So the industry, factories were mixed in with where people lived in the centre of London. Now, this revolution was never turned into anything violent, luckily. This is in the morning, and by 10 o'clock, the crowd had reached its maximum extent, which historians think was up to 50,000 people from all over the country, as I said. But by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it had completely faded away. Everyone just disappeared, I guess, went back home, and there were just children playing ball on the common. Now, there were 2 people who attended this but weren't in the audience there. They stood outside of the railings, and they were John Everett Milley and Holman Hunt, who walked to see what was going on. And they weren't actually special constables, but there were a lot of people who were observing the Chartists, and a lot, some say over 100,000 special constables have been drafted in to make sure things didn't get out of control. And those special constables included Gladstone, Robert Peel, and surprisingly, Prince Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who was living in England at the time in April. It didn't get out of hand. It faded away. It never turned into a revolution. The petition was handed in by one of the organizers. It didn't have a great deal of effect, because the second Reform Act, Voting Reform Act, wasn't passed for about 11 years. But the Chartist movement faded away. I won't go into why. There's lots of different speculation as to why. But let's stay with the Pre-Raphaelites who attended this. The important thing here that is this idea that it's a revolutionary time. Things were changing. There was revolution across Europe, and the Pre-Raphaelites wanted to bring about a revolution in art. Now, who were they? They divide into 2 groups. There were the 3 well-known ones: John Everett Milley, the Holman Hunt, and Dante, Gabriel, Rossetti. And they sat down one Saturday evening in September 1848, a few months after they'd attended that revolution or meeting, and formed what they decided to call the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. I'll tell you more about those three in a moment, because they're the main three, the three artists. But shortly after they decided to form the Pre-Raphaelites, they invited 4 other people to join who are less well known. Thomas Walner, the one on the left, was a sculptor who shortly, well, a couple of years after this, they were formed after 1848, he emigrated to Australia, but later he came back again and became a fairly well-known sculptor and poet. James Collinson was an artist. This is there is a self-portrait of him, and but he was very, very religious. I say but because just to give you an example of how religious he was, he fell in love with Christina Rossetti, the poet, and changed from being a Roman Catholic to a high Anglican in order to marry her. But he decided that leaving the Catholic Church was too much for him, so he broke off the engagement, became a Roman Catholic again, later became a Jesuit priest, and he renounced his membership of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood a couple of years later, when what he regarded as a blasphemous painting was exhibited by John Everett Milley more later. The final two, Frederick George Stevens and William Michael Rossetti, who is a brother of Rossetti, were poets, and more significantly for our story, they were art critics. And so the Pre-Raphaelites got a good publicity over the next few years because 2 leading critics were members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Let's tell you more about the 3 main ones. So you can see from this that the 3 artists really were the 3 at the top, and they were a bit like, I've called it a boy band, in the sense that they were completely different personalities, and they reinforced each other. Now, of course, the Pre-Raphaelites only stayed together as a society for 5 years, of quite a short time. And in that time, they were quite controversial. But let me describe the personalities so you can get a better understanding of the people behind the paintings I'm going to show you. First of all, John Everett Milley was a child prodigy. He was one of these people who could paint from the age of 3 or draw from the age of 3. And he was the youngest person ever to join the Royal Academy School when he was 11. He was a born artist. He was very sociable. He loved everybody. Everybody loved him. He was one of those people that loved, he was like a country squire, a country gentleman. He loved to hunt. He loved to shoot. He said he never read a book. He got on well with people. People got on with him. He was a good sort. He was and he worked extremely hard. He was described by everyone as one of the hardest working artists. He never let up. He just dedicated his life to art, but he had fun as well. So he was a party person, good to be around, and an honest, jovial, sociable person. Hunt was dark-haired, but also dark personality, athletic, strong, wouldn't get the wrong side of Holman Hunt. He was a boxer in his spare time. He was called Maniac by his friends as a nickname. That gives you an idea of the sort of person he was. He was very easily offended, so you had to be careful around him. But he had a lot of self-doubts about his abilities and about his life and so on. He suffered from breakdowns. He was very religious. Of the three of them, he was the most religious by far. The other two were hardly religious at all, particularly Rossetti. But he was committed to art. He worked very hard at art. So for Milley, it came naturally. Hunt had to work at it, which he did. He worked hard. So he was a serious artist. And finally, Rossetti was the intellectual. His father was a professor. His father was an Italian who had left Italy, and he came to England and was made professor at King's College. So he grew up in an intellectual family. He studied poetry, Italian poetry. He studied at Dante. He was a Dante expert. He was a romantic, a womanizer, charmer. He was unreliable, though, an insecure, troubled, a selfish person, but a spiritual person, interested in deep meanings of things. And as a final sort of way of looking at them, let's think about them as a brand and think about why would a patron, why would somebody buy one of their paintings? You'd buy Milley's paintings because he was definitely going somewhere. He was a child prodigy. He became an associate of the Royal Academy at the earliest age and an academician and so on. So he was a successful artist. Holman Hunt you would buy because he was serious and you could trust him. And if you had religious inclinations, he was the most religious and worked, so a hard worker and fairly well known. And Rossetti, I think you'd buy his paintings because he was an intellectual, a romantic artist, a sort of a typical romantic genius type of artist. So let's get on with the works. Now we've you'll remember that we came down here, the centre of the Devine Hall, turned left and went into the Tudor room, the 1540 room, went through the other rooms and came out into, with today, the 1840 room. There's actually a much quicker way. You can just turn left and go through the other door. But let's imagine we're carrying on with the tour and we come through this door here, which is this door. And we go past John Singer Sargent's Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose. We go past John William Waterhouse, the Lady of Shalott, and we're turning to the right here. And we're going to go down to the end of the gallery, which is where there's a little group of early Pre-Raphaelite paintings. So let's go into the corner here, and you'll see there's three that well, there's four actually that I might look at, but there's three that I'll take in the order in which they were painted. The earliest is this one by Rossetti, then I'll go on to this one by Milley, and then this one by Holman Hunt. So let's start with this painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, The Girlhood of Mary Virgin. Rossetti actually wasn't a religious person, so we don't know why he painted this apparently deeply religious painting. Maybe because the symbolism, he was just intellectually interested. He let's start with the Virgin Mary over here. You'll notice that they've got halos, which has got their name written in them. This is the Virgin Mary, this is her mother Anne, and this is her father Joachim. And the Virgin Mary is engaged in producing an embroidery, which is of this lily here, which of course is a symbol for the Virgin Mary, this lily in front of her. It's interesting in that embroidery, you normally work from a pattern, but here she's working from a still life. So it's what this is saying is that embroidery is an art like other arts. It involves creativity and can be done from life. So what Rossetti is doing is he's making a comment on the unity of all of the arts, including embroidery, which wasn't really recognized as an art until much later. The vase, or this vase here in which an angel is holding, or in fact, just about see pouring some water into this lily, is resting on some books which are labeled and represent the virtues. And this first book, it's hard to read these, so I'll read them out, and they're in Latin as well. It's charity, faith, hope, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. Oh, and I've just seen Dante, Gabriel, Rossetti, 1849, and PRB, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And as I said, this is the first Pre-Raphaelite painting to be exhibited. Now, it wasn't actually exhibited at the Royal Academy because typical of Rossetti, he was very unsure of himself. He didn't think he thought he might not be accepted. So he displayed it down the road at the Hyde Park Gallery, which was a free exhibition. In other words, anybody could submit their work and it would be displayed. It got some attention, this work, quite positive in a way. It was bought for £80 by the Marchioness of Bath, the wife of the Marquis of Bath. And they were friends of the Rossetti family. The Rossetti family was quite well connected because his father was a professor at King's. And we see other symbols. It's full of symbols. You can see here the cross. You can see the holy dove here in the distance on the hill. You can see it's either Jerusalem or New Jerusalem. The symbolism is quite complex, and Rossetti actually wrote 2 sonnets explaining the symbolism of the dove, the lamp here and its meaning, the rose, the flower, the vine, the colors he used gold for charity, blue for faith, green for hope, and white for temperance. He explains in the sonnets. So I mean, Rossetti himself was an agnostic, but I think he enjoyed going through the symbolism. But let's move on to the Christ in the house of his parents, which was revolutionary. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was formed as a revolutionary organization, but a revolution in art. The reason they called themselves Pre-Raphaelite is they thought that all artists from Raphael onwards had followed a sort of formula which was still being taught, and the High Renaissance was revered by artists in the Victorian period, and the #1 artist they revered was Raphael. And so what the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood said is that when we look at art before Raphael, it seems to us more honest and more direct and more less contrived, less exhibiting, playing with skills. Someone's just asked me what's the significance of the person pruning. That's in the previous painting. That's Joachim, that's the father. I don't know the exact, sorry, I don't know the exact significance of pruning, but it's that I think the ivy represents the church growing over the cross. And so I think he's tending the church is the way I would interpret it. But coming back to the symbolism or the meaning or what we're looking at in this painting and why it was regarded as so controversial. Oh, maybe I should talk about what some of the critics said first, because then you'll get an idea. It was called ugly, but let me quote from what Dickens wrote. Where it is possible to express ugliness of feature, limb, or attitude, we have it expressed here. Such men as the carpenter might be undressed in any hospital where dirty drunkards in a high state of varicose veins are received. It was described as horrible, ugly, disgusting, no conceivable admission of dirt and even disease, all finished with the same loathsome minuteness. That's an interesting observation, because one of the things the Pre-Raphaelites did is to paint from nature and to paint in extreme detail, because just to give you an idea of how they thought about other painters, Sir Joshua Reynolds, the founder of the Royal Academy, they described as Sir Slosh, Sir Sloshua. So they thought that artists of the previous 100 years were taught in a formulaic way to techniques to represent a tree, for example. They just sloshed on paint, whereas the Pre-Raphaelites thought they should go back to nature, look at exactly what was in front of them, and paint it in minute detail. It's a sort of similar in a way to the Impressionists who went back to nature, but whereas they created a quick impression of nature, the Pre-Raphaelites thought they should represent the extreme detail in order to be honest and true to nature. So coming back to this painting, we see in the center Christ. He's just cut his palm of his hand, signifying later the crucifixion on the cross and the stigmata. He's cut his hand on this nail here. We can see the bottom of the nail is blood. The blood from his hand has dripped onto his foot, signifying the wounds of Christ. This is the Virgin Mary, whose cheek he's kissing. This is Jacob, his father, the carpenter, who is leaning forward, and Anne, Mary's mother, is offering a pair of pincers to extract the nail. This is assumed to be John the Baptist, because of what he's wearing here, this sort of animal cloth, and he's bringing water to signify baptism of Christ to wash the wound. This isn't anyone in particular, and they seem to be making a door. Milley actually went to the trouble of going down Regent Street, where there were a lot of carpenter shops at the time, well, a small number of carpenter shops, and he sketched the arms of carpenters, of actual carpenters, and used it here. This person here is, I think he's Milley's father. And this is Milley's mother, I think. These are based on models were people they knew. They didn't believe in using professional models. Where possible, they used friends and relations because they thought they would be less stilted, it'd be more natural. And he also, from a butcher shop in Regent Street, bought 2 sheep's heads, which he used to as models for these sheep's heads, these sheep, that's us, the flock outside. So why was this apparently religious painting so disparaged? It's because, and here I'll read a quote, the Art Journal wrote, "The most beautiful souls must have the most beautiful body." In other words, they thought this was too realistic. They were looking at the Holy Family being represented as real people, and that just wasn't on. Just to give you an idea of what was barely acceptable, it's this painting by John Rogers Herbert. Now, in fact, I think it was F.G. Stevens wrote, one of the 7 Pre-Raphaelites, the art critic. He wrote that what the Pre-Raphaelites are actually trying to do is out Herbert Herbert. So he was a well-known artist, born about 18 years, so 20 odd years before the Pre-Raphaelites, so an established painter. This painting of the Holy Family was also criticized, but not so in such an extreme way. A lot of critics liked it, some thought it was going too far. Whereas but you can see that in this painting, he is idealizing Jesus and the Virgin Mary and so on. So that's about as far as you can get away with showing the Holy Family in a natural way. What you couldn't do is show them like this. And so we didn't, I can't overemphasize the extreme loathing that people had for this painting. It was as revolutionary as some 20 years, 13 years later, Edward Manet's Olympia was in Paris at the Paris Salon. That was revolutionary because it was so controversially honest about prostitution and sexuality. And this painting was revolutionary because it was so honest about religion. And to complete the trio, Holman Hunt painted this painting between, let's see, I think it was August and December of 1852. And you can see it's got two titles, Our English Coasts 1852 and Strayed Sheep. You might wonder why. Well, there's two interpretations of this painting, and also there's a third way of looking at it. So first interpretation is that at the time, 1852, everybody was worried about the French invading. And so this painting is showing the beautiful, what we have to protect, the beautiful English coasts, but also how unguarded they are. A lot of people were worried that we hadn't done enough to guard our coasts. And here it's just being guarded, the coasts are being guarded by a flock of sheep. So our English coasts refer to that political situation at the time. Now, a couple of years later, he exhibited it in France and changed the title to Strayed Sheep. So it's just a representation of a cliff and some sheep. And at that level, it's probably the most revolutionary Pre-Raphaelite painting in the sense of well, maybe until we get to Ophelia, in terms of the time taken to produce it. John Ruskin, I haven't mentioned John Ruskin yet, but he's central really to the Pre-Raphaelite story. Some years before 1843, he'd written a book, Modern Painters, which went through a number of, someone just asked me how long would this take, I think it's this one take to paint. It was every day, excluding Sunday, of the same spot in front of the situation on plein air, outdoors, painting from August to December of 1852. So what Ruskin wrote is, go to nature in all singleness of heart and walk with her laboriously and trustingly, having no other thoughts but how best to penetrate her meaning and remember her instructions, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing, believing all things to be right and good, and rejoicing always in the truth. Ruskin was a very religious person, and the part of that that's often quoted is reject nothing, select nothing, scorn nothing, as a description of what the Pre-Raphaelites were doing. They were painting exactly what they saw without rejecting things, selecting bits to paint, and without scorning, because for Ruskin, it was all, and for Hunt, it was all God's nature that was being represented. One thing that's often pointed out, I mean, there's the butterflies here. He actually got some butterflies, I assume mounted butterflies in the studio, which he painted. The other thing that's often pointed out is the ear of the sheep here, because you can see the blood vessels in the ear. He's shown the sunlight shining through the ear accurately. So everything is closely observed and accurately represented. By the way, by this is a sort of the situation probably, I don't know, August, September, maybe the shadows are getting a bit long, but by December he was painting in the rain, the wind and the bitter cold, but he stuck it out. He had a big umbrella which he had to tie down because of the wind. This is typical of the early Pre-Raphaelites and their dedication to painting in detail, fairly bright, or if you like, natural colors, accurate representation, rejecting nothing. I don't want to spend time on this one, but I think it's useful to show it to you. It's by Milley, and it's a portrait of Mrs. James Wyatt and her daughter Sarah. And I'm just showing it to you because they're obviously, you've noticed already, they're so stilted. They look like dolls. And Sarah's holding a doll, and there's another doll here, and there's a picture of doll-like people in this book. And they're not looking at each other, and they're looking very stilted. But behind them, there's a Leonardo, Last Supper, but there's two Raphaels, which we know at the time Milley rejected Raphael. So what is he doing here? No one knows. He's either emphasizing something psychological about these two people, which I don't think he is. I think what he's doing is he's hinting at paintings like this, Giotto, which is pre-Raphael, and this is the Madonna di Ognissanti, the enthroned, or Our Lady of All Saints. But you notice the way she's sitting and the way Christ is represented, and the similarity. And there was a lot of paintings of this sort, and the way that he's represented the two there. So I don't think it's a comment on their relationship, that she was a bad mother or anything like that. It's a reference to the style of painting of the pre-Raphaelites, before Raphael, that he was trying to return to. I didn't want to spend long on that one though, because there's quite a few on this wall. And how are we doing for time? Oh, okay. Which one shall I start? Well, maybe I should start with this one quickly, because it's the follow-on to the previous Rossetti, Ecce Ancilla Domini, is it's like Behold the Lord, and it's the Annunciation, and the Archangel, is it the Gabriel? I think Gabriel has come down to impregnate the Mary. And we see that there's a lily that he's arguably pointing at her womb. And she unusually is sitting, looking on her bed. That's very unusual. She's usually seen at prayer, and looking afraid, which we have seen in some previous paintings, but it's a very unusual way of representing her. And remember, Rossetti is extremely well read, and what he's doing is he's representing the way this scene is described in the Bible much more accurately than the way it's normally represented. The other thing that people, and critics didn't like this painting. It was exhibited not at the Royal Academy again, but critics saw it and they disliked this painting even more. Partly because it was by then thought that, or realized that the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were trying to undermine the ideals of the Royal Academy. And the other word that worried people was the word brotherhood, because it was associated with revolution. And the other aspect that worried people is that these scenes Rossetti painted and the way he's represented them suggested Catholicism, which was also very contentious at this time. So what with the mixture of radical revolution and Catholicism and a brotherhood all mixed together, it's was fueling the criticism of the reviewers. They pointed out that they thought he was never trained in perspective. The perspective of this bed and the wall and the window are wrong. It's all at the wrong angle. They said that he's had weak technical ability and wasn't properly trained. I don't think any of that's true. I think he painted this symbolically in the way he wanted to paint it, to get across the feeling he wanted to get across. He wanted this angle here, this space here between the bed and the angel. He wanted, this is the Holy Dove coming in, and it's all painted intentionally. He didn't want wings on the angel. He's got flames at the feet. This was actually praised by Ruskin, who thought that the adding wings was the wrong way of showing a spiritual person, and he admired the way Rossetti was trying to show spirituality in a different way. So a contentious painting, and here we see the link to the previous Rossetti painting. This is the finished embroidery. And which, yes, let me show you a Holman Hunt of a few years later, 53 to 54, about the time the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was starting to break up and go their own separate ways. This is called The Awakening Conscience, and a lot of some of the critics didn't get the meaning. They thought, what one critic in particular described it as brother and sister. So here we have the sister and the brother have been singing a song together at the piano, and she's just standing up because her attention has been attracted to the view outside. And this here, if you can make it out, this is the frame of a mirror. See, this is the frame of a mirror here, which is showing the back of her head and what she's looking at. We can see her looking out into the sunlit garden. So she's just standing up to go and look into the garden. But other people realize what it's really about, and that is prostitution. This is not a brother and sister. This is a man and his mistress. And to paint this, Holman Hunt actually rented a property in St. John's Wood, which was known as an area where men would buy rooms or rent rooms for their mistresses. She doesn't wear a wedding ring. They're singing oft in the stilly night, which was a well-known song at the time, where the person in the song has a sudden spiritual revelation. So what this is saying is that she is a mistress, but God's work, that is the garden outside and the sunshine, has made her suddenly realize the error of her ways, and she's just standing prior to rejecting him and being redeemed. But of course, there was no redemption. And Ruskin, who understood all of this, wrote, "The very hem of the poor girl's dress, at which the painter has labored so closely, thread by thread, has story in it, if we think how soon its pure whiteness may be soiled with the dust and rain, her outcast feet falling in the street." So the trope for Victorians was that a fallen woman, there was no hope. The only end was suicide. Well, I'll talk more about that later. The model, I was going to say, was Annie Miller, who at the time was the girlfriend of Holman Hunt, and it's a long involved story, because Holman Hunt went off to the Holy Land and left her behind, and left her books to learn to read and write, but she became the model of Rossetti, and strayed, shall we say. That was typical of Rossetti. And when Holman Hunt came back, there was a big argument, but this is prior to him going off to the Holy Land. And so this is a model that, if you like, he fell in love with and intended to marry, as long as she could improve herself. Just a few final points on this particular painting. The cat under here, you might not have noticed, but this here is a bird, is playing with a bird who will shortly die, in the same way that he is playing with the woman. The woman here, this statue inside this glass dome, is like the woman inside this flat that's been rented. And also the shape of this painting is same as the shape of the dome. And then down here, there's a gentleman's glove discarded in the same way that she will be discarded. And the tangled skeins of this embroidery that she's working on indicate the tangled situation that she's trapped within, just like this statuette is trapped inside this glass container. So again, a lot of symbolism, a lot of detail, a lot of work has gone into it. It would have taken months to paint, and he painted it, as I said, in an apartment he rented for the purpose in St. John's Wood. So that's given you, Holman Hunt was of all of the three artists, of the Pre-Raphaelite artists, was the one that maintained the faith, if that's the right word. He maintained the faith both religiously and in terms of what the Pre-Raphaelites were all about right to the end of his life. And he lived longer than the other Pre-Raphaelites, and he always painted in this, he continued to paint in this detailed way. But Milley didn't, and Rossetti, although he continued painting, spent far more time on his poetry. Maybe how are we doing for time? Let me quickly show you this John Rodham Spencer Stanhope, because for two reasons. One is it's to show you that other artists were influenced, this is 1859, were influenced by the Pre-Raphaelites, who, although they were vilified in the first few years, they became accepted by society, by artists and by critics as being the standard. And the Pre-Raphaelite style of painting became very influential, and a style that carried on all the way through the 19th century. So even though they broke up, what they'd founded, what they'd started, continued. So here's an artist who was influenced by this detailed style. And also he's showing, it might not be obvious, but this again is a prostitute in her lodgings, this time near Waterloo Bridge. That's Waterloo Bridge in the background there. And you can tell it's a prostitute because of the disarray. Down here, the clue is a gentleman's walking stick and a gentleman's glove. The fallen flowers showing that she has fallen, the cheap jewelry, the money here, and the fact that she's wearing night clothes in the middle of the day, and were all obvious indicators to the Victorians, who, again, this doesn't show that she's going to be redeemed. In an earlier version of this, he called Thoughts of the Past, he showed her looking out of the window and up at the sky, in the same way that saints pray to heaven. So that painting could have indicated redemption, but this painting just shows her as worried, guilt-ridden, if you like. And also Waterloo Bridge was a center for prostitution, and it was also the bridge that women threw themselves from to drown more often than any other bridge. It was known as the bridge that women committed suicide from. And so that indicator, that symbolism in the background, is another, adds to the meaning of this painting, which again would have been obvious to any Victorian. So just showing their influence, I'm taking a slightly different turn now, because although this is fairly detailed, I don't think, and this is 1857, I don't think we can see Emily Osborne as directly influenced by the Pre-Raphaelite. She's painting in a similar detailed style, but it helps if I describe her history to justify that. She was born about the same year as the other Pre-Raphaelites, but she was a child, I think it's fair to say she was a child prodigy, and she didn't have a, she didn't come from a very wealthy family, but they managed to transfer to London. And so she got schooling in art, and she showed her work at the Royal Academy. She got accepted, in other words, for her work to be hung at the Royal Academy when she was just 17. And that work was bought for £200 when she was 17. And she was commissioned by Queen Victoria to paint a painting. So in one leap, she'd become a well-known and not wealthy, but well-established artist. And she continued to exhibit nearly every year, not quite every year, but nearly every year for the next 40 years, as long as she continued painting. So she became an established artist. That's Emily Osborne. But what are we looking at in the painting itself, called Nameless and Friendless? You'll see that the woman, just a quick overview first. There's a woman with a boy who's probably from their ages her brother. She's wearing black, so she's in mourning. She's given this painting here to this man behind the counter to examine, we assume to sell to him. It's being looked at by this man here in a sort of an approving way, but these two gentlemen here, if that's the right word for them, who are looking at a scantily dressed ballerina, are ogling her. So what's going on? Well, this is another aspect of Victorian life, that because families, there were very few jobs for women. There were things like servant and governess and working in a shop occasionally, but there were relatively few jobs for women. And the household was maintained by the husband father. So if he died, the husband or the father in this case, then the family could become destitute overnight. And that frequently happened. Middle class, fairly wealthy families became destitute overnight. And so they would immediately have to look for work, which, if it was mostly women and young children, wasn't forthcoming. So what's being signified here is a young woman who is been from a wealthy-ish family, who's been trained in art as one of her accomplishments, has brought along one of her paintings to try and sell it to make money to keep to buy food to keep the family going. And she's accompanied by her brother, who's looking anxiously directly at the man to see whether he's buying it. It's left open as to whether he's going to reject it because he's looking doubtful, or whether he's just looking doubtful to get a better price. And my interpretation of this painting, you interpret it how you like, is that this young chap up the stairs is not looking at her, he's looking at the painting in an approving way, that I think this man is going to buy it, but he's going to negotiate a very low price for it, and that's why he's looking doubtful. In the meantime, just to explain, that every Victorian society would know that a woman like this, well presented, well dressed, in mourning, has just lost a father or a husband, and is looking to make money by any means possibly. So that's that's what they're thinking. There would probably accost her as she goes to leave the shop. So hopefully what will happen here is that she'll sell the painting, get the money, and leave the shop, and become successful at art. But that rarely happened. But it did happen with Emily Osborne, who this year, the year this was painted, 1857, was one of the founders of the Society of Female Artists. So she wasn't the only one, but there just weren't many. Whether to talk about this dad here, let me carry on. Let me talk about this because it carries on this this horrible theme. Wrong painting. Let me go back. Whoops. I'll have to, oh, here we go. The link was incorrect. Augustus Egg. This is a sort of triptych. It's in 3 parts. There's 3 paintings, but this is the key one to the story. It's called Past and Present Number 1, Misfortune. So what's going on here? Probably most of you by now, from what I've told you about Victorian society, can guess what's going on. But I'll tell you quickly. The man who's looking distraught is holding a letter which we assume, we can work out, is evidence of his wife's adultery, because he is simultaneously, it's a bit hard to see this, but he's crushing a miniature of her lover under his foot. She is begging him to stay, but she's wearing bracelets that look like shackles, manacles, and he has just cut open this apple here with this knife, and half of the apple has fallen to the floor, and we can see that it's rotten in the core, which should tell you that she's already prepared her bags, and we can see in the mirror the open door by which she will soon be leaving the house. In the meantime, her 2 children are playing with a house of cards, which has just collapsed. The structure of the family has just collapsed, and it's again hard to see this, but in the original you can see it. The book they're resting the cards on is a French novel, which was the French novels were regarded by the Victorians as salacious and encouraging adultery. So that would be a novel that the wife has been reading. So people would say, well, typical, that's the sort of literature she's been reading. It's not surprising she's been led into bad ways. And to emphasize that, behind we see a portrait of her, and here the expulsion from Eden, from paradise, of Adam and Eve. And over this side, his portrait, and above it, a ship in a storm. So I really need to say no more. The symbolism is obvious. So let's quickly move on to the next one in the series. Here we see the 2 children some years later. I think it's meant to be, they look a bit older than this, but I think it's only meant to be about 5, 7 years later, not that long. It shows a night scene. It's important. Look at the moon and the cloud. We'll come back to that, but you'll see that they're in mourning. One's in a nightdress, but the other's in mourning, because, and on the wall they've got a portrait of their mother and their father, and it's their heartbroken father has just died. So they're on their own now. They've got to make a living, and one is weeping in the lap of the other. The final picture of the triptych, let me go back, whoops. Sorry about this. As I said, the link is wrong, so I think I got to it this way. Yeah. The final picture shows the mother, but notice the moon and the cloud. It's exactly the same moment as her children are sitting in that bedsit looking out of the window, and at that moment the mother is underneath an arch. These are the Adelphi arches by the River Thames, and you'll notice underneath her cloak, sticking out from under her cloak, are the emaciated legs of a baby that we assume what happened is that she became the mistress, became pregnant, he rejected her, and now she has nowhere to go other than to drown herself in the Thames. That's what's indicated by this picture. By the way, a lot of the critics thought that this painting had gone too far, that it was too extreme in showing what could happen to a family. But it did happen. On the wall here are two plays being advertised, one called Victims by Tom Taylor, that's hard to see, and the other called A Cure for Love, and they're both about unhappy marriages. And it's alongside here, you can see just about pleasure excursions to Paris, which is a reference to the novel we saw just now by Balzac in the first picture. We don't know what's going to become of her, but we can guess. Yeah, let me show you this picture, because it's not remember that we're in the 1840 room, and this is a picture that actually predates the formation of the Pre-Raphaelites. It's 1846. And the reason I want to show it is, in some ways, it's one of the most important or significant paintings in the room, because although you might not notice it in passing, this is the first representation, accurate representation of the poor in Victorian art, which led to a whole series of what's called social realism, the representation of the poor, which became an established genre. But this is the first. Now, it's not this painting about a seamstress that created awareness of the poor. In fact, this painting is illustrating a poem that probably did more than anything to illustrate the fate of seamstresses, and that was called The Song of the Shirt, and it was published a couple of years, well, in 1842, so 4 years before this painting. And it was by Thomas Hood. It began, with fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread, stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger and dirt, and still with a voice of dolorous pitch, she sang the song of the shirt. What this did is bring to people's attention that there was a strata of society that were poor, and that women, in order to make a living, one of the jobs they could do was sewing. But the fate of women who sewed, they were paid so little. You can see her red eyes. They often lost their sight, in which case there was no hope for them. And we see back here the medicine, which is labeled from a London hospital. It's called The Mixtures, written on here, and for her eyes. And we can see other women working outside, and they used to work nearly all night long. You can see it's 2:30 in the morning, and they worked by just a single candlelight because they couldn't afford more than just a single candle. If they dropped a stitch, their wages, if that's the right word, the piecework rate was reduced from making a mistake with a single stitch. And so they barely earned enough to feed themselves. And here we see a tiny little morsel of bread. So this is the fate of those women that lose the support of their husbands because the husband has died. And this was bringing, in fact, the poem is what brought it to the attention of society and led to the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. Middle-class women who had fallen on hard times, who were taking on this terrible work, were deserving and so deserved charity. But most Victorians thought of the poor as deserving it because they were born that way, they were lazy, they drank too much and so on. And so they didn't deserve any support. So this distinction arose between the deserving and the undeserving poor from the poem, which became a sort of cult's the wrong word. It became fashionable to buy Song of the Shirt produce. It seems a bit odd, but things were embroidered with the Song of the Shirt poem. So it became fashionable to be seen to be supporting seamstresses and so on, to work. It's where a lot of Victorian women started to spend their time working for charities. On the other side of the room, in a different style of painting, is one I wanted to show you, worth looking at when you're in the room. William Dyce. Now, William Dyce didn't typically paint this way, and it's in a lot of detail. So in that sense, it's pre-Raphaelite-like. He's maybe experimenting with the pre-Raphaelite manner, style. But what he's representing is, again, in a sort of a pre-Raphaelite way. He's representing a particular event. It's called Pegwell Bay, Kent, a recollection of October the 5th, 1858. So why should we recollect that? Because, and this is a bit hard to see, but up here in the sky, you can see a comet coming down. It's Donati's comet, which was visible in the sky at this time and was a big event. Lots of people went out to see it. Somebody's asking me how the previous paintings, I think it must be the previous paintings, were received. And I've already told you that the egg had a mixed reception because people thought it went too far. This painting was regarded as unusual because he mostly painted religious paintings. And this is only religious in the sense that he's showing God's, a scene of God's world and God's comet, but it's not apparently religious. It is mostly seen as a comment on time, and I think that's a good analysis. I don't know whether that's what Dyce intended, though, but we can see the comet, which has been, it returns, I should have said it returns every 2,000 years. So here we have a reference to something last seen 2,000 years ago. We have the chalk cliffs, which were laid down millions of years ago. And what they're doing here, and I think I might have a close-up. Let me just see if that works. Oh, I should also point out that over here, the close-up's a bit fuzzy, but over here is an artist, and it's hard to see, but this here is a maul stick. Artists used to balance their hand, and over here is like a sketch pad. So maybe it's William Dyce is unusually showing himself in the painting. This is the enlargement. So we have three figures who are actually his relations. I think it's his sister, his wife and her sister and his son, and they're collecting shells, which was a well-known Victorian hobby. Women would collect shells and glue them to boxes and so on. But it also represents geological time. They're taking an interest in things that were fossils that were laid down millions of years ago, and also shells of animals that have recently deceased. So there's levels of time being involved. And this is a very popular dinner party discussion revolved around Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which laid out a timescale of millions of years, far longer than the Bible timescales that most people believed in. So it was controversial and much discussed. And it could be a reference to the interest in geology that a lot of people had. That's just another reason they collected fossils and shells at this time. So it remains a bit of an enigma. It was produced, we know he actually visited Pegwell Bay. It was painted on the spot in 1858, and it was a popular holiday resort near Ramsgate. And it's, as the Pre-Raphaelites did, it shows members of his family, but it hardly seems to be a portrait of his family. Maybe it's just equivalent to a holiday snapshot. I don't know. We're looking down, we came in this door over here, we're looking down to the end of the gallery. I'll look at some more paintings in this gallery next week, but I just wanted to show you the one of the most popular, arguably the most popular painting in Tate Britain. It's the one that most foreign visitors ask where it is, more than any other painting. It's in all the guidebooks. Visit Tate Britain to see John Everett Milley's Ophelia. To produce it, somebody asked earlier, how long would it take to paint? Well, I've got much more accurate information about this painting because he wrote letters and notes about his time to paint it. He spent, it was painted on the Hogsmill River, a local river in other words. And if you if you know Tolworth Tower, I'm sure you all know Tolworth Tower, but if you go down the road opposite Tolworth Tower going south, and at the second lot of traffic lights take a left towards Worcester Park, it's the Hogsmill is there, and there's a field there, still there, called the 7-acre field, and we know that's the field in which he put up his easel and painted for 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, over 5 months. He said that he could manage to paint an area about the size of a crown, an area about that size, and each day. And remember, Milley was a child prodigy, was one of the fastest painters of all of the Pre-Raphaelites. It's representing, and of course, because he painted over 5 months, flowers changed, and there's flowers that bloom at different times in this picture. Also, because he was in a field, it was owned by a farmer who often tried to chase him away. And of course, it rained often. He said the worst thing were the swans who came to bite him, and the midges when they came out. He said he couldn't do anything about the midges. He just had to sit there. So he had an umbrella to keep the rain off and off the easel and the painting. He had to tie it down when it was windy, but he stuck it out for 5 months, 11 hours a day. In fact, all the daylight time he had. It's of course Ophelia from Shakespeare's Hamlet, who drowns herself in a river after Hamlet denies his love and inadvertently kills her father. We assume drives her, I was going to say drives her mad, but drives her to suicide. And the flowers that are shown are those that are mentioned in Hamlet, and Milley has added a few more as well, as flower symbolism was a big thing in the Victorian period. Lovers used to send their beloved flowers with forming messages, but poppies mean death, so obvious things. Daisies, innocence, pansies, love in vain, and so on. All of this. In fact, if you look at flower books of the Victorian period, and they're available on the internet, the flowers actually have different meanings in different books, but there were some, the ones I just mentioned were sort of commonly accepted meanings. Some of the more obscure meanings, I think you'd have to know the book to decode the flowers you'd been sent. So an extremely arduous task, a dedication to painting like this. This is 1852. Without going into a lot of detail, you may know that John Ruskin's wife, Effie Gray, left John Ruskin because the marriage had never been consummated. So it wasn't a divorce, the marriage was just annulled. And a year later, married John Everett Milley. I just gave you that bit of background. My intention is not to talk about the life story of each of these artists, but I gave you that bit of background just to explain that from about the time he became married, I think was 1854, something like 54, 55, he started to paint in a much looser style and much quicker. And he sold everything that he painted. And he became the wealthiest artist, I think until recently, probably the wealthiest artist Britain has ever seen, and was eventually, just before his death, made president of the Royal Academy. So extremely successful. And he's, remember the critics' feedback on his Christ in the house of his parents, all of that was forgotten. He became a part of the establishment. He became a Royal Academician, painting in a style that everybody loved and was accepted by everybody, and was a very sociable fellow that and honest fellow that nobody could really see anything to reject. And similarly, his later paintings, no one could, starting I think with Ophelia, the critics were full of praise. I think I've got time for one more. The Whistler I'll cover next week. This is April Love by Arthur Hughes, a very popular painting for cards and so on, partly because of the bright colors. But let me just, there's a lot more detail in this one. So let me just take the final 3 minutes to talk about Derby Day by William Powell Frith, because it was a much more popular painting than April. April Love was liked by the critics, but this was liked enormously by the public, who flocked to see it, and they had to put railings up in front of it, and people would spend I think literally hours examining each person in the painting. It's Derby Day at Epsom. This is the old Epsom, whatever it's called. And let's go through some of the people, because it's all of life was there. Oh, by the way, Frith took these paintings very seriously, and this one was the first great success for Frith. And 4 years, Ramsgate Sand was the first successful one for Frith, and this was 4 years later. And he hired, for example, a photographer to go round Epsom at Derby Day, taking pictures of interesting people that Frith would use in producing these different portraits of people. And he also hired models for all the major figures, including the jockey, the acrobat, and so on. And he told the photographer, take the picture of as many queer people as you can find from the roof of a cab. Looking over on the left here, there's a gambling going on here. I think this is the thimble. Find the P underneath one of three thimbles. This is outside. It's a bit difficult to read. It's outside the Reform Club, which have got a tent here. And so there's some wealthy people going in and drinking. And then because there's a lot of wealthy people going around, there's this ability to gamble. There's a wealthy person here gambling, someone here who we assume has just lost all their money. What's happening here, this is interesting. This person is working with the gambler. He's going around showing a £5 note and saying, I just won this, it's easy to see where the P has gone. And this person a yokel, if you like, or a farm worker, is taken in by this. Oh, it's easy to win £5. And his wife, who spots there must be a catch, is stopping him for going to gambling. So there's a little scene here of what's going on. This woman here, I think I've got yes, this woman here was a well-known personality, and he's included her. Incidentally, you might notice here, and in fact in the painting, her waist is so narrow. That's corsets, but also this is a photograph, but photographers would manipulate the photograph to make the waist just a little bit, I mean, the waists were very, very narrow, but to make them a little bit narrower, because this was seen to be, surprisingly, this was seen to be attractive, these extremely narrow waists. And she was a woman who, and this was a popular activity, young women would ride up and down the Horse Guards Parade, or the Hyde Park. So so a well-known person is being shown in the picture. There's the acrobat, who's there's a joke here. The acrobat is waiting for his boy, probably his son, to jump so he can throw him up in the air, but the son has been distracted by all this food that's being laid out here as a picnic for this man here, who is probably his mistress, is in the carriage here, and there's a gypsy woman trying to beg from her or sell her something, but he's got his eye on this young flower seller. I think I might have an enlargement of that part as well. And so I've got an enlargement of the picnic because I wanted to show you the size of this pie here, and that I think is a whole chicken there with an enormous pie in front of it. That's what's attracted his attention, while everybody is standing around waiting for the acrobatics, and there'd be someone, I can't see where he is now, collecting money afterwards. And then have I got, yes, here is the picture of the man who's eyeing up the young flower seller, and there's another acrobat over here in the distance. Okay, so that's enough for today. Next week, we go around the same room and pick out the pictures associated with the aesthetic movement. And then after that, there's another, so we've had 2 so far. After next week, there'll be another 5 talks to complete our tour